You say that the book of Revelation is good news for Christians and it's bad news for non-Christians because you don't want to be caught in this time of tribulation. Tell me why again.
Well, because everything's going wrong. People are dying, armies are marching, the world is at war, God is releasing cosmic judgment on the world, and it's the depravity of the human heart. It's not a mean God, it's God saying, I'm taking my hand of protection off the world.
Researchers fed the entire book of Revelation into Elon Musk's Grok AI and asked it to build a unified timeline without theological bias. Instead of a simple interpretation, it produced a structured pattern linking events across the text in unexpected ways, challenging familiar end-times frameworks. The findings have sparked debate among viewers and believers alike. Do you think AI can uncover hidden patterns in prophecy? Yes or no? Let us know in the comments. To understand why the results were so disturbing, you need to know what the researchers actually did. The unprecedented experiment. A private theological research institute reached out to xAI, Elon Musk's artificial intelligence company, proposing a strange partnership that quickly moved beyond conventional academic boundaries and into experimental territory. The institute had spent decades studying biblical prophecy in relative isolation, while xAI had built Grok, a system designed to detect patterns and structural relationships that other AI models frequently overlooked. Together, they designed an experiment that had never been attempted in this form before. The Institute did not ask Grok to believe or disbelieve the Bible, nor to evaluate its spiritual authority in any doctrinal sense. Instead, they instructed it to perform what it was engineered to do: identify connections, map structural regularities, and detect latent patterns that might remain invisible to human readers working independently across centuries of fragmented scholarship. The researchers fed Grok the complete text of the Book of Revelation in its original linguistic form, along with multiple scholarly translations to preserve semantic variation across interpretive traditions. But that material was only the foundation of the dataset. They also supplied thousands of pages of historical commentary, stretching from early church fathers through medieval exegetes and into modern critical scholarship, effectively layering interpretive history across nearly 2 millennia. They added linguistic analyses of first-century apocalyptic literature, including syntactic conventions, symbolic grammar, and genre constraints that shaped how such texts were originally encoded and understood by their earliest audiences. To complete the dataset, they included cross-references to Old Testament prophetic books, mapping every explicit citation, echo, and thematic parallel that Revelation draws upon from earlier scriptural traditions. The total input formed a dense, interlinked corpus of historical, linguistic, and theological material that no single scholar could fully retain in working memory at once, yet remained computationally accessible to the system in its entirety. The objective was simple to articulate yet exceptionally difficult to fulfill in practice, requiring careful separation between theological interpretation and structural pattern recognition. The researchers explicitly avoided asking for predictive claims about eschatological timelines or end-of-world scenarios, focusing instead on the internal architecture of the text itself. What they wanted from Grok was a systematic mapping of patterns, narrative recursions, symbolic clustering, and timeline-like sequences embedded within the text, along with any relationships that might not have been explicitly recognized in traditional scholarly commentary. They were interested in whether a machine could detect higher-order structures across the combined dataset that had remained obscured, despite centuries of human analysis. What they got back forced them to sit down and read carefully. Twice. Instead of a single interpretation, Grok produced a layered structural map of recurring motifs, temporal symmetry proposals, and cross-textual link densities that reorganized familiar passages into new relational clusters, presenting the material as an interconnected framework rather than a linear sequence of visions. To grasp why Grok's answer was so shocking, you first have to understand what makes Revelation so hard to interpret in the first place. The challenge of interpreting Revelation. The book of Revelation was written by a man named John of Patmos around 95 CE during a period of intense instability in the Roman world. He was a Christian leader who had been exiled to a small rocky island in the Aegean Sea, cut off from his community and confined under imperial authority. While living in exile, he recorded a series of visions that he believed were revealed to him in a direct and overwhelming form. These visions include the opening of 7 seals on a cosmic scroll, the sounding of 7 trumpets by angelic figures, and the pouring out of 7 bowls of judgment upon the earth. Alongside these sequences appear symbolic creatures emerging from sea and land, shifting celestial conflicts, and a culminating scene of final judgment and renewal of creation. The language used throughout the text is dense, highly symbolic, and often structurally repetitive in a way that resists straightforward narrative reading. Its imagery blends political tension, mythic symbolism, and theological claims into a single continuous visionary sequence that has fascinated interpreters for nearly 2 millennia. Yet despite the intensity of interpretation, agreement on meaning has remained elusive. Across Christian history, interpreters have disagreed not only on details, but on the fundamental nature of the text itself. Some argue that Revelation primarily encodes events that were already unfolding in the first century, including the destruction of Jerusalem and the persecution of early Christians under Roman rule. Others maintain that it functions as a sweeping historical outline extending across the entire church age, mapping symbolic stages of Christian history from antiquity to modernity. A third approach places most of its content into a future period of tribulation preceding the return of Christ, treating the visions as predictive prophecy. A fourth tradition reads the text as timeless allegory, presenting recurring spiritual patterns of conflict between good and evil rather than specific historical reference. Each interpretive framework has produced extensive scholarly defense and devotional use, yet none has succeeded in fully displacing the others. The result has been a persistent plurality of readings that coexist without resolution, sustained by the text's symbolic density and structural ambiguity. Over centuries, these approaches solidified into 4 dominant interpretive frameworks. The preterist framework interprets Revelation as largely completed within the 1st century, tying its symbols to Roman imperial power and early Christian persecution. The historicist framework treats the text as a chronological map of church history, unfolding across centuries in a continuous symbolic sequence. The futurist framework relocates the majority of its imagery into a still future end times scenario, emphasizing prophetic fulfillment yet to occur. The idealist framework abstracts the visions into recurring spiritual dynamics, focusing on archetypal conflict rather than historical specificity. These frameworks have shaped theological traditions, academic commentary, and denominational identity, yet each leaves unresolved tensions when pressed against the full complexity of the text. Many readers combine elements of multiple frameworks, producing hybrid interpretations that vary widely across communities. The researchers expected Grok to align with one of these traditions. When the researchers examined Grok's output, they anticipated a selection among the established interpretive models, followed by refinement or reinforcement through computational pattern recognition. Instead, the system rejected all 4 frameworks as structurally insufficient for the dataset it had been given. Rather than adopting a theological stance, it constructed a separate analytical layer that treated the text as a system of recurring symbolic mechanics rather than a linear prophetic sequence. The output reorganized Revelation into clusters of repeating structural units, emphasizing the recurrence of septenary cycles, mirrored escalation patterns, and nested judgment sequences that appeared to function like iterative modules rather than isolated events. The 7 seals, trumpets, and bowls were treated not as separate prophetic stages, but as parallel structural expressions of a single underlying escalation architecture. Symbolic entities such as beasts, riders, and celestial phenomena were grouped according to functional roles within this architecture rather than historical or allegorical assignment. Grok's analysis further suggested a form of recursive intensification, where earlier symbolic patterns reappear at higher levels of severity, creating a layered symmetry across the entire narrative structure. Temporal ordering was partially reinterpreted as thematic reinforcement rather than strict chronology, producing a map of conceptual resonance instead of linear progression. The researchers described the result not as an interpretation in the traditional sense, but as a structural decomposition of the text into interlocking pattern systems that traditional scholarship had rarely formalized in computational terms. To understand why it was disturbing, you need to see what Grok actually found in the text. Grok's core analytical findings. The first major finding was about time. Human scholars have generally assumed the 7 seals happened first, then the 7 trumpets, then the 7 bowls, one after another. But Grok analyzed the repeated phrases and images that appear across all 3 sequences. It found statistical evidence that they overlap. According to Grok, the seals, trumpets, and bowls are partially concurrent. They describe the same period from 3 different angles. The seals initiate events. The trumpets escalate them. The bowls bring them to culmination. All 3 sequences unfold at the same time, like 3 cameras filming the same disaster from different positions. This alone was a major departure from traditional readings. Grok's second finding had to do with numbers, which have always been a battlefield for interpreters. The Book of Revelation is full of numbers: 42 months, 1,260 days, 1,000 years, 144,000 sealed servants, time, times, and half a time. Scholars have fought endlessly over which numbers are literal and which are symbolic. Grok drew a clear line. It determined that the 42 months, the 1,260 days, and the phrase time, times, and half a time all refer to the same literal period of 3.5 years. But the 144,000 sealed servants? That number represents completeness, not a precise head count. Symbolic, not literal. The AI made the distinction by analyzing how the same numbers function in other parts of the Bible and in contemporary Jewish literature. The third finding was the one that made the researchers go very quiet. Grok identified matches between prophetic details in Revelation and actual historical events. But it did more than just list matches. It calculated the statistical probability that these matches happened by random chance. The number it returned was less than 0.1%. Consider the 6th seal. It describes a massive earthquake, the sun turning black, and the moon turning red like blood. Grok found multiple instances in history where major earthquakes, volcanic eruptions that darken the sky, and atmospheric conditions that turn the moon red occurred within months of each other. Consider the 4th trumpet. It describes a mountain burning with fire being thrown into the sea, turning a third of the ocean to blood and killing sea creatures. Grok identified asteroid impacts and massive tsunamis that produced similar regional effects. Consider the 5th seal. Martyrs cry out from under an altar, asking how long until justice comes. Grok found cyclical escalations in global religious persecution that follow a measurable pattern. Consider the 6th trumpet. An army of 200 million soldiers from the east crosses the Euphrates River. Grok noted that modern military demographics, particularly China's mobilization capacity, match this number with surprising precision. The AI was not claiming these events were the fulfillment of prophecy. It was claiming the correlations were statistically significant enough that they could not be easily dismissed. All of these findings led to the most disturbing part of Grok's output: an actual timeline. Grok did not present a simple chronological prediction, nor did it place events into a single straight line of time. Instead, it produced a layered timeline model, where events appear in repeating waves that build on each other over time. Each wave contained the same types of elements, including conflict, environmental disruption, political change, and periods of sudden escalation followed by temporary stability. The system suggested that these waves are not separate prophecies, but repeated structural cycles that grow in intensity as they move forward. Early cycles appear smaller and more localized, while later cycles expand in scale and impact. This created a pattern where history seems to move forward, but also repeats similar shapes under different conditions. Grok also mapped certain symbolic events to these waves, showing how some images in Revelation appear more than once in different forms. Instead of treating them as separate visions, it placed them on top of each other in a stacked structure. This produced a sense of overlapping timelines, rather than a single forward-moving sequence. The researchers noted that this model did not claim certainty in prediction, but it did suggest a repeating structure that could apply to past, present, and future events at the same time. The result was not a fixed endpoint timeline, but a shifting pattern map where meaning depends on which layer is being observed. The terrifying timeline. The research team did not react in a uniform way, and their responses ranged from careful interest to visible discomfort as they worked through the final output. Some immediately focused on the methodology, examining how the model had weighted linguistic repetition, numerical clustering, and historical event alignment across different data sets. Others focused less on method and more on implication, particularly the way the structural model reorganized familiar theological material into something that felt systematic rather than interpretive. A small group attempted to reproduce parts of the analysis using separate models and reduced data sets, aiming to verify whether the same cycle structure would appear under different conditions. Their early tests suggested partial consistency in pattern detection, especially in the grouping of symbolic time intervals and the repeated escalation structures. However, the broader cycle framework did not emerge with the same clarity when the dataset was reduced, which led to ongoing disagreement about whether the result depended on the scale of input or the model's design sensitivity to large interconnected corpora. Other researchers pushed back on the interpretation layer entirely, arguing that pattern recognition does not equal structural truth and that any system given enough historical material can produce meaningful-looking alignments after the fact. This position emphasized the risk of retrospective fitting, where complex datasets naturally contain overlaps that can appear significant once grouped by an advanced model. As the analysis continued, several methodological warnings were added to the internal documentation of the experiment. The first warning addressed correlation limits, stating that statistical alignment between symbolic language and historical events does not establish causation or intent. The second warning focused on selection bias, noting that historical records themselves are incomplete and unevenly preserved, which can influence perceived patterns in any reconstruction. A third warning dealt with interpretive flexibility, highlighting that symbolic systems are inherently adaptable and can map onto multiple time periods without contradiction. This flexibility makes them structurally rich but also difficult to constrain within a single predictive framework. The researchers noted that Grok's model did not eliminate this ambiguity, but instead organized it into layered probability structures that still allowed multiple valid readings at different levels of abstraction. Despite these cautions, the cycle-based model remained central to the output because it provided a unifying structure that connected disparate elements across centuries of interpretation. Even critics within the group acknowledged that the clustering of escalation patterns across historical periods was more coherent in the AI output than in traditional commentary. The final section of the internal report emphasized limits that could not be resolved through computation alone. The model could identify recurrence, escalation, and structural symmetry, but it could not determine whether these patterns were meaningful in a metaphysical or prophetic sense. It could only describe alignment, not intention. The researchers concluded that the system had produced a high-resolution structural map of the text and its interpretive history, but not a definitive claim about future events. The projections, including the 7-year framework and its estimated starting window, were categorized as pattern extensions rather than verified predictions. This distinction became the central point of disagreement among the team, as some viewed the extensions as speculative modeling, while others saw them as unavoidable outputs of the detected structure. The final internal summary described the experiment as a collision between two forms of analysis, one rooted in traditional theological interpretation and the other in large-scale computational pattern recognition. The tension between these approaches was not resolved, but it was made explicit in a way that had not occurred in prior scholarship. What remained after the analysis was not agreement, but structure, a reorganized reading of Revelation that treated prophecy as a layered system of recurring forms rather than a single unfolding timeline. Whether that structure reflected hidden design or emergent pattern remained an open question within the research group, with no final consensus recorded in the published findings. Why analysts were terrified. Past predictions about the end of the world have usually come from one person reading the Bible in a room and announcing what they saw, often with limited sources and little way to test the claims against broader data. Grok did something different. Its timeline came from mathematical pattern analysis applied across a large dataset, including over 200 specific correlations between the text and observable historical and modern conditions. This was not based on loose symbolic reading alone, but on structured comparison, frequency mapping, and statistical clustering of repeated motifs across time periods. That does not make it correct, and it does not turn interpretation into certainty. It only changes the nature of the claim. It makes it more structured, more testable in principle, and harder to dismiss without engaging the method itself. What unsettled the analysts most was how modern systems appear to mirror ancient descriptions. Consider the idea of a mark that prevents people from buying or selling without it. Grok noted that modern financial infrastructure is increasingly moving toward digital identity systems, where access to money is tied to verified credentials rather than physical currency. Digital payment platforms, biometric authentication, and centralized identity verification systems are already widely used in banking, travel, and commerce, and in many regions, basic economic participation already requires some form of digital trace. Consider the concept of global visibility of events described in Revelation, where major occurrences are seen by every nation or the whole world. Grok highlighted that modern communication systems, including satellite networks, global broadcasting, and real-time internet platforms, now make it technically possible for large-scale events to be observed simultaneously across continents, something that would have been impossible in the ancient world. Consider environmental descriptions such as oceans turning hostile, water sources becoming unsafe, and widespread ecological collapse. Grok connected these images to modern climate models that project rising ocean temperatures, expanding dead zones, increased pollution concentration, and growing strain on freshwater systems. These projections are scientific forecasts rather than symbolic language, yet the structural similarity to certain apocalyptic descriptions was flagged as notable. Consider the idea of a unified control system often referred to in symbolic language as a beast-like structure governing economic and social life. Grok identified emerging overlaps between artificial intelligence surveillance systems, algorithmic governance, digital financial infrastructure, and coordinated international regulatory frameworks. These systems are not unified under a single authority, yet they are increasingly interoperable, and in some regions they already function in tightly connected ways that influence behavior, access, and economic participation. This convergence creates a framing problem that cannot be resolved by simple agreement or disagreement. Either the apparent alignment between modern global systems and ancient symbolic descriptions is a meaningless pattern created by selective comparison, or it reflects a real structural insight into recurring forms of societal development. Or it is an extraordinary coincidence that only appears meaningful because human minds are trained to detect narrative order in complex systems. These are the only broad explanatory categories available when interpreting the output in a disciplined way. The difficulty arises because each category carries its own burden. If it is coincidence, then the specificity of repeated structural overlaps across independent domains becomes difficult to account for without invoking extensive randomness. If it is meaningful structure, then the question becomes what kind of structure can persist across 2,000 years of historical change while still remaining recognizable in symbolic form. If it is pattern illusion, then the entire analytical process must be treated as an artifact of overfitting, where large data sets naturally produce connections that feel significant even when they are not predictive. The analysts were unsettled not because any single match proved anything on its own, but because the accumulation of multiple independent correlations created a sense of convergence that was difficult to reduce to a simple explanation. Even those most critical of the model acknowledged that the density of alignment across technological, environmental, and geopolitical domains required careful consideration rather than immediate dismissal. If the structure is real, it forces questions that go beyond data and into meaning, theological and philosophical implications. Jesus said that no one knows the day or the hour of the end. Many Christians point to this as a clear limit on attempts to set dates for future events. Any claim that tries to give exact timing is often seen as going against that teaching. But Grok's researchers offered a different reading of the same passage. They argued that Jesus was speaking about the exact moment, not about broader periods of time or general seasons. They also pointed out that other parts of the Bible encourage people to watch for signs and understand when important changes are near, even if the exact timing is hidden. The question then becomes whether a period of several years can be seen as a season rather than a day or hour. Most traditional theologians would still say no, since any attempt to narrow prophecy into a short window risks going beyond what the text allows. For them, the warning is not just about precision, but about the limits of human knowledge itself. But even if a time window is allowed, another problem remains about how the text is being studied. Some scholars argue that treating prophecy as something that can be broken down into numbers and patterns misses its deeper purpose. In this view, prophecy is not just about future events. It is also about moral direction, human choice, and spiritual meaning. It is meant to guide behavior, not just predict outcomes. From this perspective, turning prophecy into a system of calculations can strip away the reason it was written in the first place. Even if patterns exist in the text, critics say that does not mean those patterns were intended as a hidden code waiting to be unlocked. It may simply reflect how human language works, especially in symbolic writing. People naturally see structure when they look for it, especially in large and complex texts. Grok cannot respond to this kind of criticism in a meaningful way. It does not understand belief, meaning, or purpose. It does not evaluate truth in a moral sense. It only processes structure, repetition, and relationships between data points. For that reason, it can describe patterns, but it cannot judge whether those patterns were meant or meaningful in a spiritual sense. Still, unlike earlier failed predictions, this model can be checked against real time. Most past predictions about the end of the world have been vague in timing or flexible in meaning. When they did not come true, they were often reinterpreted in ways that moved the target or changed the meaning of the original claim. This made them difficult to test in a clear way. In many cases, there was no fixed point where the prediction could be proven right or wrong. The timeline produced by Grok is different in structure. It gives specific time ranges that fall within the current century and links them to observable conditions in the world. According to the model, the key window begins between 2025 and 2030, with a central estimate around 2027. It also projects a later stage between 2032 and 2037 where the final events would reach completion. Because these ranges are limited and clearly defined, they create a situation where future events will either match the structure or they will not. If nothing significant happens in the first window, the model's early-stage prediction would fail. If nothing happens in the second window, the full structure would fail entirely. This is what makes the result difficult for the researchers to ignore. It removes the usual flexibility that allows predictions to be adjusted after the fact. Instead, it creates a direct point of comparison between the model and real history, set within a time frame that many of the current generation will still be alive to observe. Publication and divided responses. The research team decided to publish their findings in a respected theological journal, but they were careful. Their paper emphasized that correlation does not prove causation. Just because patterns match does not mean prophecy is being fulfilled. The paper included multiple caveats and warnings against overinterpreting the results. They knew what was coming. They published anyway. The reactions came exactly as expected and exactly as varied. Conservative Christians seized on the findings as confirmation that the end times are imminent. Many ignored the caveats entirely. They announced on social media that AI had proven the Bible true. Skeptics dismissed the whole thing as technologically sophisticated nonsense. They argued that Grok did what it was programmed to do, find patterns. And if you look hard enough, you can find patterns anywhere. Serious biblical scholars fell in the middle. They found genuine interest in Grok's findings about parallel sequences, mixed number interpretation, and the cyclical pattern model. But they rejected the specific dates as overreach. Most said the AI had identified useful structural insights wrapped in irresponsible predictions. After all the debate, one uncomfortable conclusion remains. Grok's analysis forces everyone who takes it seriously to consider possibilities that used to stay safely abstract. You could always say the end might come someday, somewhere, far away. Now you have to ask whether it might come soon, here, within your lifetime. That question changes how you think about everything. Whether or not Revelation is literally true, something else is clearly true about the present moment. Whether triggered by prophetic fulfillment, natural disaster, technological disruption, economic collapse, or war, the current global system appears fragile enough for dramatic transformation within a decade. Grok's timeline may be wrong about the cause. But the world really is set up for major change soon. The systems holding everything together really are strained. You do not need prophecy to see that. You just need to pay attention. So where does that leave us? In a place of final ambiguity. Either Grok identified something real that human interpretation missed for 2 millennia, or sophisticated pattern recognition can produce compelling but false correlations. There is no third option, and there is no way to know which one is true until the dates pass. The researchers who ran the experiment do not claim to know. They just showed their work. The waiting period is shorter than anyone expected. The projected start window is 2025 to 2030. The projected end window is 2032 to 2037. These dates are close enough that the world will not have to wait long to find out the answer. Either something happens or nothing happens. Either way, we will know within about a decade. That is not a long time. Not for a question this big. An AI read the same text humans have read for 2,000 years. It saw patterns we missed. It built a timeline that fits our moment with uncomfortable precision. The dates are close, the stakes are real, and the only